YouTube and you type in Beth Israel Houston, and you can enjoy everything that we're putting together, all of our programs and offerings and classes and services, of course. But today is really special. Today is a special treat to welcome back our friend, Rabbi Dr. David Barak-Gorodetsky. Before I formally introduce him, I just want to make a plug. Next weekend, next Shabbat, will be a very special Shabbat. Some of us are already, I see, are on the call, but we'll be celebrating our adult B'nai Mitzvah class. These are folks who have been studying for the last couple of years, and we'll be celebrating a milestone in their own lives as they become adult B'nai Mitzvah. I see Malcolm is on here. He was one of our recent former adult B'nai Mitzvah members at the right young age of 83, having celebrated and become a bar mitzvah again. So we'll be looking forward next weekend. If you want to stream and log on and watch on Friday night and Saturday morning next weekend, please do so. Also on March 21st, a week from Sunday, we'll be formally beginning our Passover celebrations and our celebration and observances. We'll have a pickup of Passover goodies, a little gift bag, a Haggadah called the Express Haggadah that has been created for us, and I hope that everybody comes from 2 to 4. The Sisterhood will have its gift shop and pop-up shop, so you can pick up your last-minute supplies and needs for Pesach, but please do that next Sunday, the 21st, from 2 to 4. Also, more information is contained in a brand new bulletin. It just came out. You'll be getting it in homes the next couple of days. We just got ours here at the temple, and we're so excited for all the other programming that we have coming up, including Rabbi Lyon's class, a 2-part series on sexuality and intimacy in Judaism as we get into Passover and the readings of Song of Songs, which is customarily read during this time of year. That's on March 30th and April 6th. Rabbi Sadalak will be doing a session also on April 8th, a Thursday session at noon, of course, and a whole bunch of other programs and smatterings of events contained within the bulletin, including a new initiative that we're starting called Binge. We've all been binge watching Netflix. Here we're going to binge on Beth Israel. Binge stands for Beth Israel New Group Engagements, and Sheila is with us, Sheila Horn, very active with our membership, outreach, and engagement committee, and we're very excited to be launching this new group initiative. So anything you can imagine in small groups, on wine tastings, on joyful grandparenting, on book groups, on movie nights, on whatever you could think of, we're going to start forming small group initiatives here at the temple and coordinating it through our membership office. So let us know, let me know, let Liza Hirsch know if you're interested in leading or being part of these groups, and you'll see more information in the coming weeks about that. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to our guest. Let me do a little introduction. Most of us remember Rabbi Gorodetsky when he was here a couple of years ago, both in March and in October of the same year, as our rabbinic intern from Israel. But now, Rabbi Dr. David Barak-Gorodetsky is a rabbi. He's been ordained. He is in Israel Institute visiting fellow, and he's currently at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And he's going to tell us more about his experience this year being in Chicago. He was ordained by Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Jerusalem, and he served as the rabbi of the Ramat HaNegev Regional Council. He's an expert on Israel-American Jewry relations, and he teaches at the Ruderman Program for Jewish American Studies at the University of Haifa. He's got a new book that's coming out on Judah Magnus. It's called Judah Magnus, The Prophetic Politics of a Religious Binationalist, which will be published later this fall by the Jewish Publication Society and University of Nebraska Press. We are so delighted and so excited to welcome you, Rabbi, and please join us, and we look forward to learning with you today.
Okay, hi everyone. It's wonderful to be back with you. I see so many familiar faces. Of course, first of all, Lisa and Scott and Stanley and Sheila that had hosted me in their homes back when I was in Houston. I also checked the weather in Houston, and I think it's kind of more like our kind of weather these days. Although Chicago has been pretty warm, so I'll say that it's been pretty kind to us coming from Israel as well, although we had a big snowstorm and dip for a while. But I also understand that there's been concerns about that in Texas, and I've heard from friends in Austin. So I'm also glad to see that everybody's okay and that you're up and running and that things are generally fine. And, I think this has been a challenging year for so many of us in so many ways. And I think specifically, like moving into this time of Passover, I think there's definitely this one thing we would all like to be liberated of this year. And this is definitely, I think, on our minds. And I'll try to get to that as well. But I want to do two things today. We have about an hour, maybe less, and I want to do two things. I want to start actually with Torah. I want to start with a study which is geared towards Purim, about a very specific element of the Jewish practice of Purim, which is Hamitz. I actually recently learned from someone here in Chicago that you say Chometz in kind of in the Jewish American Yiddish kind of accent, but I'll use the Hebrew term Hametz, and but this is essentially the main religious, or let's say Torah kind of discussion I want to put forward. And what I want to put forward is mostly kind of internal Hasidic psychological reading of what Hametz is. So I will refer a bit to some other aspects, but this is a bit about what Hametz is for us as people on the earth these days, and what are the kind of things that we are encouraged by this idea of Hametz to kind of pursue and follow. So this is something I'll be addressing now, maybe for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And then I'd like to we'll do the Torah before the politics, and after that we'll do Israel. I'll kind of update you on some aspects that have to do with the role of the reform movement in Israel at the moment, some things you might have heard of relating also to the conversion, a ruling by the Supreme Court, and also the fact that there is a reform rabbi running for the Knesset, for the parliament, with a very good chances of being a member of parliament, and what that means, okay? So this is essentially our plan. I'll try to make it interactive when we can. We're quite a few people, but still I hope we can hold it in. And also I request your assistance in, I'll appreciate your assistance in reading out certain parts when it's required to, because I don't trust my accent enough for that, okay? Okay. So again, great to see everyone. And let's get started with this discussion of Hametz, and essentially, what is the origin of this OCD phenomenon? I mean, in Judaism, like, how did we become so obsessed with this issue of Hametz, and how we can maybe think about it differently other than panicking to the extent that we are, okay? So let's see how we can relate to that. Okay, so I want to start this by the general title that I gave the talk is Hametz and the Art of Letting Go, which is essentially where I'm leading this. But again, those of you who know me know that I'm not that lovey-dovey, and it might sound a bit on the fluffy side, but I'll try to keep it grounded in terms of really see how this relates to strongly to Jewish texts, okay? So what is the origin of this idea of Hametz? Where does this idea of leavened bread come from in the Torah? So it appears in a few places, actually. I pointed out two that I would like us to read out, and then we can move forward into their interpretations. So can someone please read the first source from Deuteronomy for me?
Just unmute yourself if you'd like to read.
Observe the month of Aviv and offer a Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God. For it was in the month of Aviv at night that the Lord your God freed you from Egypt. You shall slaughter the Passover sacrifice for the Lord your God from the flock and the herd in the place where the Lord will choose to establish God's name. You shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter you shall eat unleavened bread, bread of distress. For you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, so that you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live. For 7 days no leaven shall be found with you in all your territory, and none of the flesh of what you slaughter on the evening of the first day shall be left until morning.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'll just encapsulate this. This is essentially kind of reminding us also what the main tenets of Passover are. This is a celebration of spring. The month of Aviv also means spring in Hebrew. It relates to a sacrifice, to a sacrificial act that used to take place in the temple of the Passover sacrifice, and also first and foremost to the idea of the Exodus and to the idea of the memory of the Exodus from Egypt. And even here in this pretty early and kind of concise reference to what Passover is, we have this idea of the unleavened bread appears, and it's called the bread of distress. That's something that I will return to later on. The idea that it is in Hebrew, that's actually lechem oni. It's a bread of also poverty, but it's a bread of having less. That's kind of the potential meaning of that word. So here we have, like, again, an initial unleavened reference to the unleavened bread. And I want us to now read, if someone can help me, the second part, which is from Exodus. And here, I don't know if you do this in the Megillah reading, but usually every time you say Haman, there's supposed to be some kind of, so every time they say unleavened here, you don't have to do anything, but try counting it out. And then we'll kind of, let's see what this actually means, the fact that it is kind of memorized so many times or repeated so many times. So can somebody read this part from Exodus 2? From Exodus 12, sorry.
Go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to read.
Okay, here we go. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the very first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. You shall celebrate a sacred occasion on the first day and a sacred occasion on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them. Only what every person is to eat, that alone may be prepared for you. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout the ages as an institution for all time. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. No leaven shall be found in your houses for 7 days. For whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a citizen of the country. You shall eat nothing but leavened, and all your settlements you shall eat unleavened bread.
Okay, I think you can kind of agree with me that this is a bit obsessive, right? You know, there is so much of the idea of not eating unleavened is repeated so many times in this specific text. This can be for various editorial sources, considerations, but effectively, you know, this is a holiday celebrating us leaving Passover, and there's various aspects to it. And then we see this entire issue of unleavened being repeated so many times. In this specific passage, it says twice that you will be cut off from the house of Israel if you eat unleavened bread. So there is one way of addressing this excessiveness of the issue of leavened bread is kind of a more historical approach to kind of understanding the role of sacrifice and the role these kind of the role ritual acts played in antiquity. From a kind of modern perspective, the entire ritual aspect of eating is kind of demonstrated here, going, of course, also in the discussion of the roles of kosher eating in Judaism, but you can see a really, really strong emphasis on this issue of Hamitz, okay? So I wanted to kind of bring this as the background to kind of a discussion of what is the meaning of this, okay? So Judaism is well known to be a interpretive religion and it has interpreted the tradition throughout the ages. So I want to show you, to take us forward into like a few avenues of how we can pursue this idea of Hamitz and how we can pursue the role this can play in our current understanding of Passover. I also add, this is a famous Israeli artist called Zev Engelmeyer, and this is a bun of Hamitz, like driving down the road. I actually used to live not far from, I think, where this was kind of, where is envisioned in this picture, and you have a woman calling Hamitz. It kind of also, I think, demonstrates this kind of, you know, very strong idea. I'll just say that on the halachic side, there's also the issue of the fact that you are not supposed to see Hamitz. It's not just about not eating Hamitz, okay? So in terms of just a little recap on the Jewish laws related to that, you're not supposed to see Hamitz, you're not supposed to eat Hamitz. There's a process in which you are supposed to eradicate all the Hamitz in your house. You're supposed to, after that, do a cancellation of the Hamitz. So even after you physically eradicated it in the house, then there's a process in which you say, I cancel it if I missed it. And there's also a process in which you are supposed to search it, which has also been kind of later translated into walking around with the candles. So there is a lot in our culture that has to do with with this issue of Hamitz, okay?
And Rabbi, would you just help us with the definition of Hamitz as we should understand it?
Hamitz essentially is unleavened bread. It's bread that has been left to sour. The word Hametz is practically also the word sour in Hebrew, and in that sense, we will see that also in the kind of following psychological kind of understandings. But it's something that when the Jews essentially left Egypt, they did not have time. The entire idea is having left in haste, and when they left, they had to leave in haste. They prepared bread that was unleavened. They could not just wait for their bread to kind of rise. So it kind of demonstrates also the kind of the anxiety and like the immediacy of the process of the Exodus from Passover. Thanks for asking that. Okay, so what do we do with this? How can we interpret this within the relationship of our culture, within the context of our culture and our lives? So the first source I brought you is from an Agadah by an organization called Ma'agalei Tzedek, or Circles of Justice. And I think this will resonate very much with kind of our reform sensibilities about social issues and social justice. And can someone read this out for us? What Hametz spells out to be here? I'm going to be asking you over and over, so just unmute yourself, and it's fine. It takes a few seconds, and we've been accustomed to that in the world of Zoom. So can anybody read this?
God, may it be thy will that as we have exterminated the Hametz from our homes today, so you will grant us and assist us and help us to exterminate the moral injustices from our society. Poverty, slavery, exploitation, humiliation, imperviousness, and turning a blind eye. And grant us and our households and all the people of Israel the sensitivity to notice injustice, the courage to bear responsibility, and the power to transform the reality. And grant us that we are infected with love, compassion, and sensitivity for now and forever. Amen.
Does anybody want to respond to this? What do you feel about this?
It certainly seems like a modern interpretation of Hametz. I mean, I'm not sure that the rabbis were concerned about moral injustice originally. So this is a lovely paragraph, but certainly geared more towards our modern day sensitivities.
But it makes it much more meaningful, the concept of, instead of just being worried about something physical, we're worried about something that affects our lives short and long term, before and after Passover.
Okay, great. I'll respond to kind of both. That's an important discussion, what is our what is our mandate to transform the tradition into things that have relevance for us. And this is on the one hand, it's fair to say that Hametz itself was not understood within the context of these specific aspects, though they might also be understood in the context of slavery, exploitation, etc. Can definitely be understood within the context of Passover. Okay, but there's also a strong claim about let's make this relevant, let's make this something that relates to our life, and then you have this idea that is of like this equivalence, just like we exterminate Hametz from our home, let's exterminate Hametz from our society and from our surroundings. So this is very much kind of a social justice, social kind of reading of Judaism. And of course, Judaism is many other places where it has many references to issues of social justice in the words of the prophets specifically, and in other places that we can resonate with that. So that is one direction of it, like a modern interpretation of Hametz, which is like a cultural, societal, modern interpretation of Hametz in relation to tzedek. But I want to take you a bit more into the kind of Hasidic line of thinking, and I want to say something about this. Again, I've taught at Beth Israel before, and I remember the kind of, I would say, strict Maimonidean kind of line. Essentially, we have a rational understanding of tradition and of faith and of God in general. But I want to take you in kind of the Hasidic path, or like a Hasidic exploration, which kind of the main and essential idea that it builds upon is the idea that it kind of transforms the ideas of redemption into the lives of man, into the personal life of man. This can make Judaism very relevant for many people who can find the language of Judaism echoed in their lives through these texts. And I'm going to bring a few rabbis from kind of Hasidic lines of thinking that transform this idea of Hamitz into kind of psychological, one might say, understanding, and kind of suggest for us, that is something that I'd like to open some discussion and hear kind of your voices on what Hamitz can mean for us on a personal level. So can someone please read Rav Kook for me, Between Slavery and Freedom?
And when we check for the chametz in the light of the candle, we also check the chambers of the heart to purge the yeast of slavery that has clung to our souls, so that we can enter the light circle of our holiday of freedom with a high spirit, clean from any stain of slavery, whether it be the manifest slavery which humiliates the splendor of the soul and opacifies the nobility of the spirit, or the concealed slavery which falsifies itself by the fake colors of superficial and insipid freedom propagated by the blind masses.
Okay, so this is a formidable kind of discussion of what freedom really means, I think, on a personal level. Can anybody relate to this? Does somebody want to respond to this understanding of freedom? Does this echo for someone? I'd like to kind of, we'll go further more into one or two of these possibilities, but let's see what he's actually kind of essentially claiming here. Okay, so
I'm very much struck by how this is in parallel to the one before it, and they're from two very different sources. I believe Rav Kook was a 20th century chief rabbi in Israel, considered whether Hasidic or Orthodox or strict. He certainly wouldn't have been considered modern day reform. And yet, using different semantics, different words and imagery, if you could scroll that so we can see both paragraphs 3 and 4, it would help. He talks about using the metaphor of chambers of our heart and purifying or rooting out moral injustice within ourselves, whereas paragraph 3 is talking about greater society. But his last phrase, the fake colors of superficial and insipid freedom propagated by the blind masses, as echoes of Marx with the opium of the masses being religion. It strikes me as being a very surprising me that it's a core value, that yes, it is your spirit and the heart. On one hand, I keep reminding myself it's the intellect as well as the emotions, but that it's important not to, the phrases we're familiar with, not to be enslaved by the cult of celebrity, not to be enslaved by likes on Facebook. I think that's what he's talking about.
First of all, Dina, it's great to hear your voice. I have a strong memory of us studying together quite a few times. And you've always had good insights. Again, I appreciate also, first of all, that you had pointed out that Rav Kook is not this modern Reform rabbi. Okay, this is an Orthodox rabbi in the first half of the 20th century, the chief rabbi in Israel, and considered a very strong authority in modern Orthodox Judaism and religious Zionism in Israel. And he points out very strongly to this idea that the holiday of Passover is also an internal process within the heart of man, okay, and within the world of man. And as you said, he points to like two forms of slavery, right? There is a form of slavery that's obvious to us. We look at people who are in forms of physical slavery, God forbid, or various other forms of exploitation that we will automatically identify as slavery. But he also talks about a form of internal slavery, which is kind of, in a way, I would say, a form of lack of authenticity, or a form of which, you are a slave to the fact that you are responding to superficial and not really the demands of your soul, he would say, but the demands of society, of the demands of culture. And this is kind of a call for us, if you follow this guideline, if you're willing to kind of go with him, to kind of, and this is something that, again, on a Jewish basis, you're supposed to do every year, to kind of look inside and say, what am I a slave to? What is my heart enslaved to? And this is the kind of line, I hope you're willing to go there a bit, but this is the kind of line that these sources are essentially taking us, okay? Okay, let's do one or two more of these strongly Hasidic, and I'll end with a modern text as well, okay? So if we look at number 5, okay, which is the Sfat Emet, okay? The Sfat Emet is a Hasidic rabbi from the 18th century or 19th century, related to the rabbinic line of Gur, which is a very strong rabbinical Hasidic line, also strong in Israel. And this is his understanding of Leviticus, he reads here from Leviticus. And can someone read number 5 for me? I'll do that as well. If nobody's picking it up, I'll challenge.
I'll read it.
Okay, go ahead.
And every Passover, the person of Israel becomes like newly created person, as it was in the Exodus from Egypt, like a newborn baby, and that singular point that God had planted in the souls of Israel is renewed in him. That point is called the bread of distress, that is without any expansion, since a mitzvah is since a matzah is actually the dough that later changes and is soured.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's try and unpack this, and also take the Passover elements as well. Okay, this is an 18th, 19th century Hasidic Orthodox rabbi reading a very kind of, you would say, psychological or modern reading of what Passover means. Okay, and it talks about essentially the idea of Passover as a renewal, as a point in time for a total renewal of the human being and on the person and on the individual. And this also has to do with various interpretations of Passover relating to the birth. If you think physically about Passover, about the idea of the parting of the sea, and there's various also modern feminist readings of how that relates to the process of birth. I'm just putting this as a side note, but essentially what he's talking here about is Passover as an opportunity to kind of go back to your basics, asking yourself, okay, what is your bread of distress? Stripped off all the other identities and all the expansions of your identity, sometimes also related in Hasidic thought with ego or with pride, okay? But if we've had experienced some difficult times. We've gone through, this pandemic now, and you had also gone through specific, I would say, Texas crises at the time. And when you are, I talked with a friend from the University of Austin, and he's described, life without water and life without electricity for a few days, and having to think about the essentials. So there is something that he calls here, this idea of Hamitz is something that has risen beyond what is required. It's not the essential. And then you need to kind of ask yourself, what is your point inside you, which is so-called the bread of distress, or the initial point from which, what is really important for you? And everything else is Hamitz, or things that are no longer required for you are Hamitz. And these are actually things you are expected in a way to eradicate. Can anybody resonate with that? Is that too radical for you? Can you think of something within your personal life or understanding that might respond to? Is anybody willing to kind of pick that up? I'll move forward with one more text, which is really, this is explicitly out there. Okay, now this is really an explicit interpretation of this idea, really taking it to kind of like a full-blown kind of elaboration on this specific idea. And then let's see if some of us can respond to that, and we'll end up with a little poem that in a way relates to this as well. Okay, so can somebody read number 7, Gabriel Sternger? This is the text by a psychologist, an Israeli psychologist, who wrote a book called Journey to Freedom, the Seder Night as a Process of Growth, which essentially, again, builds on this Hasidic kind of teachings in order to present a psychological understanding of Passover and of the Seder. So this is really going to be very explicit. Can someone read this? It's a bit longer, so I will appreciate help here as well.
Hamitz is food made of one of 5 types of grains that has been kneaded with water and left to stay until it had gone sour. The essence of Hamitz is therefore excessive delay that causes something to stray away from its original nature. When something's time has passed and we do not throw it away, it might go sour and change from useful to hurtful. In the human domain, there are mental contents we continue to hold on to, although they are no longer suitable for us. Beliefs, expectations, habits, defensive mechanisms, etc. A person tends to cling to the familiar, even when it no longer serves him and is even harmful. People live with habits that are destructive for them and those that surround them, out of habit and mostly on account of fear from change. These people do not believe in the regenerative powers within themselves, are afraid of the unknown, and thus hold on to the familiar, the Hamitz, and remain slaves of their past. This position leads people to miss opportunities and sometimes even miss their entire lives. The fresh bread of yesterday becomes the Hamitz of today, and the achievements of the past become the bondages of the present. The difference between the true and the fake can be razor thin. The words Hamitz and matzah are made almost of the same letters. Both have a mem and a tzaddik, and what differentiates between them is a small line that makes the hay a height. Purging the Hamitz is release of the bondages, an exodus of sorts.
Okay, so this is a really explicit reading, modern reading, psychological reading of Hamitz that I think raises quite a few issues here and quite a few possibilities. I will also point out that when he talks here about missing opportunities in Hebrew, the word is lachmitz. Lachmitz is to miss. So to miss an opportunity and Hamitz are actually from the same root in modern Hebrew. Can anybody relate, or can anybody recall something from his own life or from some kind of his own experience that would correspond with anything that we have read here?
Well, it's kind of like holding a grudge against something that, well, like an ex-spouse. Things used to be good. You've created this beautiful child, and then things go sour, but you're holding on to the anger that was created by the events. And to carry grudges to me is a very useless emotion.
Thanks. I think that's really a great example. This entire, a grudge in the sense, is a Hamitz in many ways that is described here as something that might have served you before, and this entire idea of something that used to work and no longer works, and letting go of that. Does anybody else want to maybe share something or feeling or an emotion in relation specific to this text?
Yes, I think fear of uncertainty or fear of failure, i.e. change, can hold people back and hold their spirits back. So I'll just summarize that, and I have experienced that myself and realized that.
Okay, great. So thanks, first of all, for everyone that's sharing. I kind of want us to have this idea, you know, like as we move, you know, we're going to be talking about the Hamitz in Seder, and you're going to be during the Express Seder as well. Hopefully, Hametz will not be left out. But it's really thinking of this idea of Hametz and thinking of Passover is like this, you know, kind of a spring cleaning, like for, you know, for our soul and for our relationships and for our things that affect our life. You know, what do we not need anymore? What is kind of, what have we outgrown? What is, like, you know, when are we motivated by fear? And when are we motivated by you know, in a way, by our true self? So I think there's something here that is helpful in kind of relating to Jewish tradition, which would otherwise be interpreted as a classical, you know, within the classical lines of tradition, or just, you know, as a modern OCD, but kind of relating to this as really as an opportunity to experience the text in relation to our own lives. And I want to do that. I want to end this discussion by a poem which is by an Israeli rabbi and a friend called Amnon Ribak, which it's recently really hit various Jewish circles and been added to various agadot. I'll try and maybe make it a bit smaller so maybe someone can read it. Does anybody consider himself enough of a passionate reader of poetry to read this as kind of, you know, a poetic reading? Okay, it's a little bit of drama. You can act out a bit, but, you know, just kind of. I hope I'm not scaring anybody away, but just a poetic reading of this. So can someone read this? I'll scroll down as we move a bit with the poem. It's not that long. Promise.
Every person needs to have a certain Egypt, to deliver themselves from it with a strong arm or with grinding teeth. Every person needs terror and great darkness, and comfort and promise and redemption, that they would know to look up at the sky. Every person needs one prayer, that one would always be on their lips. A person needs to bend one time. Every person needs a shoulder. Every person needs to have a certain Egypt, to redeem themselves from it, from the house of slavery, to go out into the middle of the night, to the desert of fears, to march straight into the waters, to see them open before them to both sides. Every person needs a shoulder on which to carry the bones of Joseph. Every person needs to straighten their backs. Every person needs to have a certain Egypt and a Jerusalem, and one long journey that they will forever remember in their feet.
Hey.
Don't we have a Friday night prayer that talks about having an Egypt or
The
David?
Egypt of the soul.
Yeah. I think there's a prayer on Friday night.
I think it's in the. I'm not familiar with it directly from the Siddur. It might be a later rendering or a text, but it definitely, you know, seems to follow with this idea, right? And this is actually taking, you know, one of the most important mitzvot or in Passover is that every person needs to see himself as if he has gone out of Egypt. That's a Talmudic text, and later. So that's pretty deep in the culture, and this is the entire issue of the retelling of the story. But this really takes us to the level of, you know, experiencing, you know, the Exodus of Egypt is something that's personal. This entire discussion of the Exodus from Egypt is, in a way, a story of personal redemption. Can be understood as a story of the redemption both of the people, of course. That's the main tenet of our understanding of this. But also, does anybody know what the issue of the bones of Joseph is?
Don't forget your past, where you came from, and the fact that Joseph didn't want even his bones to be left behind. He wanted his bones to go back to the family burying site.
Thanks a lot, Dina. So that's really, when the people went, according to the tradition, when they went in the land, in the desert, they took with them the bones of Joseph in order to put them back where they belong. So there's so many, there's a lot of tropes here and a lot of things to think about. Also having a Jerusalem, okay, having a destination. I think maybe I'll end with this, okay. Egypt has to do a lot with the process of going out and releasing yourself from slavery, but having a Jerusalem is also having a place to go to, and that we say usually L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. So I hopefully that I'm not in Jerusalem these days, but I hope COVID relaxing a bit and things changing, that you also get both on a personal level and on a physical level to Jerusalem. But also I'd kind of like to leave you with these ideas of Hamitz as something that you can and with this ideas of Passover and with this poem, is kind of things you can relate to in the specific time we are at, and at the specific junction in time of history and Jewish history and general history that we are at the moment, that we can kind of correspond to this in relation to what's happening in our lives and in relation to the community and to our life in general. So thanks everyone. I kind of try to make it really stick to the time, which is a very Israeli thing to do, and leave us with about 15 minutes to talk about Israel. And this is a bit of a transformation, okay, from this kind of very Hasidic kind of internal kind of reading of Passover to a discussion of current political situation in Israel in relation to the reform movement. I'll say maybe just two initial things, and then I'll open it for questions, and any thoughts or questions you might have, I'll appreciate it. There's been two main developments in Israel now in relation to the issue of religion and state, and in relation to the issue of the role of the reform movement in Israel. And although I'm not there at the moment, I'm obviously following as well and aware of the deeper implications. So the first one was a ruling by the Supreme Court in Israel that had to do with the fact that within the law, which is called the law of return, which is a law that was initiated in 1950 and then revisited in 1970, that's the law that actually claims essentially that Jews have a right to return as citizens to the land of Israel, kind of established the law is from 1950, from the early, post-Holocaust days, and this idea of establishing the state as a place where Jews can come back to. That was amended in 1970 to say also that it also applies to Jews that had converted. And that has become a bone of contention because there's no specific definition of exactly what conversion means or by whom, and this has become a discussion in Israel about the way in which reform conversions are acknowledged by the state. So I'll just say a few words about this, also having been a rabbi in Israel that had performed conversions and what they meant. So initially, first of all, conversions in the US are conversions done by the reform movement in the US are recognized in Israel for various aspects, including for the sake of the law of return. The discussion was specifically on conversions done in Israel by the reform movement. So that's one initial thing I want to point out. The other thing is that conversions do take place in Israel anyway and are recognized for the sake of being registered as a Jew by the state. That's another important reason why people turn to conversion in Israel. And I'll say one more thing about that. A lot of the people turning to conversion are people who have a Jewish grandparent or father, or not necessarily orthodoxly considered halachic, that had came mostly from the USSR, from the former USSR, and that there's a huge population who are interested in this. But this specific law had to do with, this specific ruling had to do with converts that want to change that want to be received into the state of Israel and accept citizenship by conversion, and that was recognized that for that sake, reform conversion is acknowledged as well. And this was considered a legal victory for the reform movement. Has been pushing this for about 15 years in courts, and this has been delayed for about 15 years in court, going back to the very complicated and from our point of view, sometimes painful discussion of how reform is accepted or not accepted in Israel. But this is considered a very strong kind of achievement in that sense. So this is the one thing I want to say. I'll say the second thing, and then I'll open it to questions or discussions. The second thing is that the Labor Party, which is the Labor Party is historically the party that had ruled Israel until 1977, the party of David Ben-Gurion, the party of the kibbutz movement, and of the party that essentially established the state in many ways. And currently, under Labor Party slate in Israel, Rabbi Gilad Karib, who is the former CEO of the former just until recently, because he just resigned on account of what I'm describing now, is the CEO of the reform movement in Israel, Rabbi Gilad Karib, and he was elected as the fourth person on the Labor Party slate in Israel. Now, in terms of Israeli elections, there is a relatively new law that says there are many, it's a multi-party system, it's not a two-party system, but essentially you need 4% of the votes in order to get into the parliament, meaning you need to have at least 4 people, there's 120 people in the Knesset, that you need to have at least 4 people elected in order to get your party into the parliament. That means that either Gilad Karib will be a member of parliament starting the 4th elections in Israel in the last 2 years, which is in March 23, either he will be elected as a member of parliament, or the Labor Party will be outside of the Israeli parliament, which is in and of itself an unimaginable situation in many ways. So this is just to say that a reform rabbi is going to be a member of the parliament on behalf of the party that had ruled Israel for many, many years and is considered like the backbone of non-Orthodox Zionism in Israel, or labor Zionism, or secular Zionism. And this is just to say that can be a very, very influential moment in the relations of the reform movement to the state of Israel. And there's been a lot of objections already to that in Orthodox circles, but that's definitely, I think, let's say, a potential game changer in relation to the role of reform and the acceptance of reform of Israel. And this also has to do with who eventually builds the coalition and who becomes prime minister, and all these various other minor issues that have to be resolved until then. But this is the big picture. Okay, so I see there's a few comments, and I might, maybe some of them, I see that Gilad Karib was a scholar in residence just recently. I'm not sure he has resigned. He might have postponed his role until the end of the elections, but I will say that the chances that he will be elected are very, very high. And it's also understood that he will not be able to continue his role once when he is elected as a member of parliament. So any questions about this, about current elections in Israel, the relevance of this to us or to the relations? Any thoughts?
I'd like to ask you a question, actually more about the Hamitz rather than this.
Okay, that's good as well.
As I understand and I listen and I watch to what's been read, tradition is tradition, and the tradition of the Orthodox is not taking into the same consideration in my mind is what I'm hearing today and what I believe, that modernism is there. Not you change the laws of Judaism, but you interpret it differently. And as I read from and listen to what you're saying and what I read, is that not what you feel, and what's the feeling of a majority of the reform movement in Israel? Or just tell me what you think.
I think generally, reform there's two elements. I'll say this also as a scholarly in a kind of way. There's a restorative element to reform. And that is the idea that reform in many ways claims that these are original ideas that have always existed in the tradition, for instance, of the prophets, and for instance, in other places. And we are actually reenacting these original ideas that were falsified throughout history by excessive legalism. I think that's maybe one way to understand this. So I think I can respond to or I can relate to your feeling that essentially this is modern and has always been. I will say that in terms of the specific sources where I've brought of people I've referred to, Rav Kook, and Dina said this as well, is a very strong kind of Orthodox authority and kind of a founding father of religious Zionism in Israel in many ways. So just to say, this is on the one hand, part of our tradition as well, and on the as let's say as Reform Jews, and on the other hand, this is part of the flesh and bone of Orthodoxy. So this is maybe I hope this addresses. I see there's one or two more political comments. I'll just react to them as well. What does this mean to the effort to create a pluralistic space for prayer at the Western Wall? I'll just give a short background on this. In 2016, there was a decision by there was an agreement reached by including the Jewish Agency, which was kind of the moderator of this, that was supposed to initiate or to kind of formalize the arrangements around having a egalitarian prayer section, which is already existing, but is not formally recognized in a certain way. And also in terms of access, a lot of this has to do with access routes. And this eventually was supposed to be realized and then fell on this solution, which would have given reform and conservative prayer in the Western world, let's say the place it deserves. This solution was eventually annulled by political considerations, kind of never actually enacted. I think you would expect that once Gilad Karib is a member of the parliament, he will push forward with this idea as one of the most essential ideas he will be pushing forward with. And I think at the end of the day, it depends a lot on the political constellation and who's in power at the moment. The arrangement was acceptable to quite a few elements within Orthodox Judaism as well. It's not, in many ways, for instance, it doesn't give Reform Jews specifically rights for prayer within the main section. And there's various other ways in which it was actually acceptable for many people, and maybe there will be a political constellation that will be able to address this. In terms of the Israel-US relationship at the moment, maybe my 60 seconds on this, I think, have to do, there's been a political change in the US, and that has very strong influence on the relationship. There's political elections in Israel, and that might have an additional influence on the relationship. Obviously, there is concern about the reemergence of kind of, let's say, tense relations between Israel and the US in case Netanyahu is elected again, because there is precedence to see what happened during the Netanyahu-Obama relationship, and it's not expected in many ways to be different, and points of tension regarding Iran and very specific issues. But I think we have to kind of wait and see what happens with current Israeli elections. And also in that context, also to understand how complicated the Israel political system is. It's not just about who gets elected, it's about all these various parties forming and reforming, and who's going to be in a coalition and who's not going to be in a coalition. And many things can be different, and let's see how that goes. That's like my really 60 cents on this. And on the issue of COVID in Israeli life, my Facebook feed is full of, Daniel Gordis is an interesting book. I definitely recommend reading it. Just 2 words on COVID. First of all, Israel is the most vaccinated state or country in the world by far, and has been this from the beginning of the vaccination process. This is, amongst other things, because the health system in Israel is not fully privatized, but is run by 4 main organizations. We have a lot of data and a lot of quick access to people, and can very quickly, analyze their data to say who should get the COVID, the vaccination first and who last. And it's a small country at the end of the day. So currently the situation is that most people in Israel are vaccinated. Most of the adults, and there's 5 million people being vaccinated in Israel out of a total population of 10 million, out of which 3 million are kids. So we're talking about a real majority of people being vaccinated, and very strong influence on everyday life. I keep on seeing people's pictures of their first time having coffee or whatever in a restaurant after so-and-so time. So the things seems to be opening up in Israel in many ways. And I hope that eventually moves forward as well. And also I'll say that the data, that a lot of the research about the effectivity of the COVID vaccinations is based on Israel, because it's such a small country on the one hand, and also the data is really effective in understanding that. And I think we have that's 3 minutes to go. So David, do you want to David Scott, do you want to kind of summarize and maybe add a word or two?
Well, I'll just say thank you. There's not much more I could say on top of what you've so brilliantly shared with all of us. I think there's so much to unpack. If you're interested or would like to have some of these texts that Rabbi shared with us, I'm sure that we can make them available. Just let me know and we'll forward them to you if you're interested. This is also on, will be on YouTube later on this afternoon or tomorrow, and you can go back and watch and listen and read some more of these as well too. I just want to say thank you as well to the Israel Advocacy Committee, without whom we couldn't have done this. And I see Stanley is with us, Stanley Horn, one of our co-chairs, Ruth Sherman, Martha Barvin are also part of our leadership, and many of us are on the committee as well. If you're interested in being more involved with Israeli programming and things that we're doing with the congregation on behalf of Israel Advocacy, please let us know. Please join our committee and get involved with this. Our next Israel trip, if you got your taste buds excited and you can't wait to get back to Israel or visit it if you haven't been, May of 22, May 8th to the 18th of 2022 will be our next congregational trip. So I hope that you're able to join us for that. Also, as Passover comes closer to us, in today's e-news, you'll probably see some video links and other ways to learn more about putting on your own Seder and some recipes from Marcia Gilbert, of course, and our kitchen staff. So enjoy those videos. March 23rd is the Tuesday before Passover begins. And on that Tuesday night, we're also going to be joining at 5 o'clock with congregations all over the country as the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, the seminary that ordained Rabbi Barak-Gorodetsky and other rabbis and cantors around the country in the Reform movement, and educators like myself, will be hosting a program on Chester Holman III. He was a man who was wrongfully imprisoned for 28 years and was exonerated a few years ago, and he'll be sharing his story with us. Really a very visceral experience of slavery and redemption from that experience. So that's going to be at 5 o'clock. Followed by our Passover workshop at 6:30. If you haven't hosted a Passover Seder or you'd like to learn more deeper insights about Pesach, that's on the 23rd of March. And more information will be in the bulletin as well as the e-news and on our website as well. First night of Passover is on March 27th. And on March 28th, our first day, we'll have our festival services. And that evening, instead of our second night Seder, when we would welcome 400 of you to the Wolf Tumim Hall, instead, we'll be having a series of conversations about the themes of Passover hosted by our clergy. So that's on March 28th at 5 o'clock with the Yizkor Memorial Service on the last day of Passover, April 3rd. All of these are in the bulletin online through our website, and you can register for each and every one of them through the Shul Cloud calendar, and all the Zoom links will be sent directly to you. So with that, I say thank you and very much appreciate Rabbi Gorodetsky being back with us. We look forward to visiting with you again, and look forward to hopefully hosting you in person before you return back to Israel. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, and happy Passover.